Hello, everyone. My name is Carolyn Roth, and I'm the moderator of today's session titled Fighting Inequality Through Progressive Taxation. This is an extremely significant and important topic, and it has been one even before the COVID-19 crisis, but now it's gaining in significance. Now the stakes couldn't be higher, given the enormous economic and losses that we're looking at, the human losses as well. The world has been unjust before we saw the COVID-19 crisis. So how do we tackle inequality through progressive taxation? That's one of the key questions we want to discuss in today's panel. How can it work? We're going to touch on some of the issues that are linked to it, such as the wealth tax and also how to avoid tax evasion by some of the biggest multinational companies of this world. And I want to invite everyone to discuss with us, and let me introduce to you the panelists, Ms. Chidi King. She is from the International Trade Union Confederation, Mr. Norbert Walter-Borjans from the Social Democratic Party in Germany, but also Mr. Wayne Swan from the Australian Labour Party. He's also a member of ICRIT, which stands for the Independent Community for Reform of International Corporation Taxation. We'll call it ICRIT from now on. And Mrs. Gosch, also a member of ICRIT. Thank you all for being here. Mrs. King, I want to kick things off with you. As I mentioned just a few seconds ago in my introductory statement, we know that the world, even before COVID-19, was characterized by social injustice. And now we know that millions of jobs have already been lost or will be lost. We see estimates that 500 million people could slide into poverty. What do you think are the most pressing steps to tackle this issue right now?
Hello, thank you. Good morning from this part of the world. The effect of the pandemic is already being felt in terms of massive job losses around the world. We know that even before this pandemic hit us, as you said, the inequalities that were playing out in our societies are already making millions of workers vulnerable to any type of shock in our economies, let alone the devastating economic shock that is coming along with the tragic impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. So we have been seeing over the past decades a decrease in formal, decent, good standard jobs, good quality jobs. We've seen instead a rise in precarious jobs, a growth in the informal economy, a transfer of risks away from employers back onto individual workers, destruction or disruption of the employment relationship. And we're seeing the devastating consequences of all of that now as our economies shut down and as people are required to go into confinement and therefore not able to work for millions of people. We know that, of course, for the lucky ones who are able to work from home, who are able to hold down those good jobs with, social protection backed in with direct employment contracts, the situation is much better. But for the majority of the world's workers, including those in the informal economy, including those in platform businesses, including those in disguised self-employment relationships, the situation is catastrophic. It really is.
So what kind of tax policies could play a role in addressing some of these issues? We've seen governments around the world really rally in terms of coming up with very creative ways when it comes to tax policy, just to mention some of them: extending deadlines for tax filings, for example, deferral of tax payments. We're looking at provision of fast tax refunds, more generous loss offset provisions, some tax exemptions, including for payroll taxes, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of measures, concrete measures, can governments work with?
Well, I think we also need to look not only at what's needed immediately now to address the impacts of the coronavirus in terms of tax reforms and innovations, as you say, to tax policy, but in the longer term, because this is going to be with us for a very, very long term. And, as a trade unionist, I would also say this is where social dialogue between employers, trade unions and governments is absolutely crucial. As trade unions, we've been saying for a long time that the way that the global tax system is structured absolutely needs to change. We've moved away from progressive taxation systems increasingly to regressive taxation systems where the move has been away from direct taxation onto indirect taxation, which means in effect that those in lower income brackets have been paying disproportionately more tax, relative to their earnings than those in higher income brackets. That needs to change. We need to move away from front-loading taxes like value-added taxation or goods and services taxes back onto wealth taxes, as you mentioned, taxing the wealth correctly, ensuring that, income tax is proportionate to your earnings, ensuring that there's proper property tax rather than tax breaks.
Sorry to interrupt you. I want to pick up on that point that you mentioned, the wealth tax, because sitting here in Germany, obviously there's a lot of press around that. And there's one party in Germany, the Social Democrats, they want to reintroduce that. And I want to ask the former finance minister of Germany's most populous state, North Rhine-Westphalia, Mr. Walter Borjans, who is member of the Socialist Party, of the Social Democratic Party. Why you think it's a good idea to reintroduce it now, and where the funds would essentially come from? I mean, in theory, it sounds amazing. In practice, does it really work?
For this, we have to say that in Germany, wealth tax exists. In 1997, though, it was suspended. It was not abolished, it was just no longer applied. There were reasons for this back then. The German Constitutional Court ruled that real estate property was not appropriately included in the assessment of wealth. So instead of correcting that wealth tax or improving it, what was said was, we'll just suspend it. That was the reason, because back then income tax was way more progressive than it is today. And when more and more the progression of income tax was reduced so that the top incomes were relieved more and more of taxes, nobody thought, well, then we would have to reintroduce wealth tax again. And now this debate is reviving. First of all, because amongst developed nations, Germany is one of the nations that has most inequalities. 10% of the population own 60% of the overall assets, or 5% own just as much as the remaining 95%. And this has a little bit to do with the fact that in Germany, a strong branch of the economy are family-run businesses, and they have accumulated a lot of capital. So, on the one hand, we need to promote the stability of the economy promoted by family businesses, but very often private assets cannot be accounted for very well. This brings me to the point, if you want to reactivate income wealth tax, the question is, first of all, how do we get a realistic assessment of assets, especially when assets are part of corporate assets or hidden in company assets, because we don't want to slow down the economy through taxation. But still, I'm saying that until 1997, this wealth tax worked well. And we could try and remedy the deficiencies that existed back then so that real estate property is also assessed and accounted for more clearly. And the disparities need to be remedied as well. For instance, startups. If we would take away from them their assets, we would take away the opportunity from them to promote our economy and promote innovation. But the basic concept behind this wealth tax still exists, and it was correct, and we could take it from there. One more point on progression. Germany actually still has progression in overall taxation, which is working considerably well. But this was not created by social democrats or socialists. It was created after World War I, that is 100 years ago, by conservatives. And they were those who fought it most strongly afterwards. Because back then they said, coming out of a crisis, the principle has to apply that the high cost borne would have to be borne more by the strong than the weak. And over the past 100 years, this was reduced gradually. Now we need to see to it that we learn from this crisis and try to take this back.
Und wir müssen jetzt dafür sorgen, dass wir das aus dieser Krise lernen, das ein Stück zu korrigieren.
Mr. Walter-Borjans, I see your point. There's definitely room for improvement when it comes to the wealth tax. And worth noting that, according to the OECD, some 30 years ago, there were more than a dozen European countries that had implemented a wealth tax. But by today, only 4 are left. Among them, Switzerland, Spain, Norway, and I believe Belgium is the 4th one. And in Switzerland, it accounts for some 3% of GDP. That's a staggering number. But in other countries, it simply doesn't amount to that much, in part because administering and enforcing the wealth tax, that's such a difficult aspect of it. So in the end, you may not benefit from all of that wealth tax that you're trying to rake in, because administration and enforcement, that's the sticking point. How do you want to address those issues?
First of all, yes, in order to levy a tax and enforce a tax, you need administration. And therefore, this is correct. But up to 1995, this tax was accounting for at least 1% of the entire tax income in Germany. And this was quite a lot. And if we translate this to the reality today, this would be 110 billion euros. And this is net value. So this certainly is worth it. And other countries like Switzerland show that this is possible. Now, on to the second point. Mrs. King already mentioned this. Around us in the world, progression was taken back quite a lot. So Germany is still more progressive, as it were, when it comes to tax rates, but also we are coming under considerable pressure. And there are strong lobbies that threaten they will go to other countries because it's much cheaper for them over there, especially for high incomes. And this is how they put pressure on policymakers. So if everything has to be rolled out on a larger scale, then I draw 2 conclusions. First of all, around Europe, around the world, we need to move closer to each other on how much we tax. If we try to race to the bottom when it comes to tax rates for high incomes, then of course this is more difficult for each and every one of us. And secondly, many things can be done at the national level, or at least at the European level, but there you would also have to combine taxes. This cannot be done by the wealth tax alone. This also has to do with a more effective inheritance tax. This also is deficient in our country. How about the taxes you just described for multinational companies? And how can Germany then benefit from this? And on the other hand, we would also have to give something back to the international community. This depends on whether you tax at the place of production or consumption, because Germany is always seen as the champion of exports. And therefore, the interest in Germany is to tax at the place of production. But other countries say, we are buying the German products, and we would also have a share in the taxes. So the justice in global progression is not a one-way road. It applies to us in Germany just as it applies to others. We cannot get this done when we work against each other, but do this together. But this is easier said than done.
You're very right in that point. And you mentioned a very important point, international cooperation. You talked about it on a European level, but Mr. Swan knows a thing or two about international collaboration because he was obviously very active during the great financial crisis more than 10 years ago. In a very stressful time also in Australia. Since then, Mr. Swan, how do you feel has progressive taxation been implemented in global politics? Do you think that since that crucial watershed moment of the great financial crisis, progressive taxation has improved, has found more fans than foes? How do you feel it has evolved?
Well, I don't think it has found necessarily more fans than foe. The fact is the destruction of progressive tax systems across the world over 40 years has produced rampant wealth and income inequality. And that is also the case since the Great Recession 12 years ago. So we've got to ask ourselves, I think, the question, that small government, low tax ideology is just as powerful now as it was prior to the Great Recession 12 years ago. So those of us that are looking for the reconstruction of a tax system to make it much more progressive, so that we can deliver a social contract, particularly investment in health and education, shouldn't assume that we've won the central argument. And the central argument is that you pay tax to buy a better society and a healthier economy. But I think if you look around the world, we've still got a bit of work to do, because whenever you talk about progressive tax, powerful vested interests come to the fore. So when we're talking about the opportunities that are coming through from COVID-19, we shouldn't automatically assume that everyone's going to say, look, the social system's been destroyed, we'll agree to increasing the tax take. There's no doubt that we have to make our tax system more progressive, and at the same time, we have to have a bigger tax take. But in doing that, we have to understand, if we're going to be successful in that endeavour, we've got to win an argument about having a healthy tax culture. It is not simply an argument about the design of one tax or another. And what we do know is that the flattening of the tax take, the flattening of tax rates, the huge cuts to company tax have made the system globally more unequal. We've got to win a debate now in an environment where revenues are being smashed. And I think it's a good time to actually put forward an argument for a bold new tax system, not just an international tax, fixing up all of the problems in the international tax system, but also for a domestic tax system that is progressively based, because you've got that example out there at the moment. Look at all these tech companies. They're going to be prospering through this crisis, and they are the world's greatest tax evaders. So it is a very good opportunity to raise this question of why we need the revenue and who should pay. Great work's been done through the OECD. Great work's been done through NGOs. Great work has been done by journalists. But we're going to have to use these opportunities now to relitigate those arguments, not just for reform of international tax, but also for reform of domestic tax systems, which means getting the OECD, the IMF, the NGOs, civil society on board for a broader tax system, which will fund the social contract that COVID-19 demonstrates we all need.
And you've written a very powerful opinion piece in the South China Morning Post recently. You said the world is losing tax revenues when it actually needs more money to fight the COVID epidemic. So all of the points that you've just presented for us, they'll work certainly in that direction. Hopefully, you also say that financial opacity is still very high. Those are some of the things that have to be tackled. But let me probe you on this. Do you actually believe that now is the time, given that, frankly, so many governments around the world are simply battling to keep people alive and are battling to keep their economies from crashing to the worst levels since the Great Depression some 70, 80 years ago? Do you think now they're actually going to be able and have the capacity to focus on whether or not they're going to follow ICRIT's proposal of, let's say, a minimum tax rate for multinationals of 25%? I know this, I'm challenging you here a little bit, but let's try and put this into perspective.
Well, not immediately. I mean, basically, the future of some societies is on the line. Massive unemployment is going to be experienced not just in the near term, but probably for some time. But what do we do as societies to counter that? Do we just sit back like we did after the Great Depression and move along the line to increase polarisation? Or do we look for a new social contract? And a new social contract can only be provided by the sorts of proposals in international tax that ICRIT is putting forward, the minimum 25% rate, which the Germans are supporting, I'm delighted to hear, but also formally apportionment. Now, the problem is that prior to COVID-19, these proposals looked like they were making progress at the OECD. It's run out of steam. Powerful vested interest, I think you could say, had a fair bit of influence in stopping them. We're going to have to go out and relitigate that argument, not just for the international reforms. And because of COVID-19, we'll be able to demonstrate that those tech companies, for example, the big tech platforms that are going to make a killing through this crisis, ought to be paying strongly progressive taxes, except profit taxes or whatever it is going to be. We should be making that case strongly now and building the case more generally, that if we want a civilised society where people have the opportunity to go for work, then taxes have to be fair and they have to be proportionate to our ambitions, and they can't be borne by the most vulnerable people in our society. And it will be a good time to mount that argument over the next 3 to 5 years.
I think we'd all fully agree with you. I want to come to Mrs. Gosh, who's also a member of ICRIT. And what we've seen, Mrs. Gosh, is that there are so many Southern European nations that have been hit the hardest, Spain and Italy specifically, by that terrible corona crisis. How do we make sure that we show solidarity with them? I know that one of the huge points of contention in Europe is corona bonds. The Frugal Four, they're certainly against it right now. But from a tax perspective, are there ways we can help those countries out more?
Well, I think certainly I'm not going to focus on the Eurozone because I think that is much more a problem of within Europe solidarity or the lack of it. But when you look globally, developing countries are actually very badly hit even without a lot of corona deaths because they have been completely smothered by this terrible combination of falling export revenues, falling tourism revenues, reversal of capital flows, declining currencies, and many of them just don't have the fiscal capacity that would allow them to do anything for their citizens. So we are actually talking about maybe 1 billion people facing hunger, dramatic declines into poverty, even death from starvation and other diseases rather than COVID-19. So we have to have much greater international solidarity right now because we are talking about a global challenge, which is actually, this is just the first one. We are currently obsessed with this coronavirus, but we are also facing an existential threat of climate change, which is also going to rear its ugly head very, very quickly. So we have to have the global solidarity that allows developing countries access to fiscal revenues. The things Wayne Swan was saying as about corporate taxation, those are absolutely true. But even wealth taxation, it's very hard for a developing country to do it because there's so much capital flight. The rich simply move their money out. So you must have a global compact. You must have, in fact, a global asset register, which will allow everyone to know who has kept their money where, which will reduce the capacity of the rich to simply evade taxes by moving their money out whenever you do institute a wealth tax. So it's very, very important to emphasize that you cannot do this alone if you're a developing country.
This is a question that I want to pose to all of you, and we unfortunately won't have the time for each and every one of you to answer this, but if one or two of you could help me out on this one, because I've been thinking as we read the news, to what extent do you feel, as we were just talking about solidarity, to what extent do you feel that the COVID-19 crisis is actually going to spark a return to more nationalistic, to more populist measures? Is this a real risk which will also hamper the progress we're making on the progressive taxation front? Who wants to take this? Yep, go ahead, Ms. Scott.
Well, you know, it's already happening, isn't it? We've just seen the United States and unfortunately my own government, India, block the issue of SDRs at the IMF, which is an appalling thing when the global community and developing countries really need liquidity. We are seeing fights over who is going to get access to medicine and tests and kits. So we are seeing the emergence of really the vilest kind of nationalism and competitive kinds of attempts to garner resources. I won't call it populist because I don't think it's in favor of people at all, but it is harking back to an extreme, virulent and aggressive kind of nationalism, which will actually undermine all the efforts that we could make to make things better.
Yes, I would love to comment on this. I think that we have now reached a watershed. On the one hand, we have growing forces to close oneself off and to try and obtain a good position compared to others, but there's also quite the contrary that is happening. There are people who are realizing that we can only do this together. Relating this to my own country, over the past years, we had a rise in populism, especially right-wing populism, and at the moment, if you can trust the opinion polls, this does not play a role anymore. Populists at the moment are not really successful because people in Germany are realizing that across political parties, we have to work on solutions together, and we need to do this more strongly. Also, with regard to the European Union, we have to keep people together within one society, but I think countries in Europe can also get this done together because countries in Europe are insignificant if they want to do this alone economically. If they want to play a role in the global economy, they have to do this together. So this is an opportunity. Not right now. We can discuss who is going to pay which tax where, but this will be about trying to make clear how much money is needed in order to have a decent healthcare system, in order to protect people who are going to lose their jobs or have to be working short time. These are enormous amounts of money. And if we try to finance this only through debt and credits, then it will be the small and middle incomes that have to bear the burden in the long run. But we don't want the social welfare state to be eroded, and we still need to mitigate climate change. This is a problem which has not just disappeared because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will reach a point where we have to discuss how we share the burden associated with this. And for a long time, burdens from developed countries were transferred to poorer countries and had inhumane manufacturing conditions over there for our consumption. And we always thought this problem will never reach us, but now climate change is reaching us. And we have social inequality in the countries themselves, because a crisis offers more opportunity for those who are wealthy than those who drop out of the system. And therefore, we have the opportunity now to advertise politically for a fair income distribution for the state. And I agree with Wayne Swan against strong lobbyism. Lobbyists who are well organized, and certain companies will try to pretend that they are the losers when they have to pay most of the taxes.
All right, we have a couple minutes left on this panel, and I want to bring to you a question from a young global changer.
Hello, I'm Johanna Bernreuther and a young global changer from Germany. My question: with billions of dollars being funneled through private charitable foundations every year, what impact does modern-day philanthropy have on the significance of the tax-based welfare state?
Maybe I can direct that question to you, Mr. Swan, and maybe to you, Mrs. King, very briefly.
We shouldn't subcontract our basic responsibilities for the state to wealthy people to decide the priorities of our countries. They should make their donations, but they should pay their tax first. And sadly, many people engaged in that important work are not paying their fair share of tax. The most important thing to remember about tax is how you raise it is just as important as how much you raise. And that's why these questions about progressive taxation are essential if we want to be able to fund the civilized services in both the developed world and the developing world. We won't get the SDGs in so many countries in my region with the sort of level of tax that is currently raised. We're all in it together. We're going to need a national and international approach to this, and progressive taxation will be the only source of funds that delivers the living standards and decency that we need.
Mrs. King, some final words from you?
And I think that sums it up very well. I don't think there's very much I can add to that, apart from to say that regulation is going to be key in terms of how we go forward in all of this. The impact that deregulation on corporations, which has allowed them so much of that corporate capture, so much of that influence, deregulation of the financial services has been enormous, and we need to start rolling that back out. And that goes to the question of these philanthropist organizations. We need to look also at how they are regulated. Yes, they can benefit our societies. Yes, they can, play into more positive outcomes, but they cannot be any substitute for the role of the state in building universal social protection systems that are gender responsive, that meet the needs of everybody, that go towards the building that new social contract that Wayne Swan mentioned. Philanthropists can't be at the heart of that. We need to enable our governments through real progressive taxation systems to meet the needs of all of their citizens and populations, and especially those who are most exposed to risk at the moment.
All right, thank you so much for that. I think that's a very strong and very strong summary, very strong closing statement here. And I want to thank all of you for taking this time on this Sunday morning. And again, hopefully we'll see each other in person very soon and continue that extremely significant and important discussion. Mr. Swan, Ms. Savata-Boyans, Mrs. Gosh, and Mrs. King, thank you so much for your time. And please stay safe and stay healthy.